Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How the Role of Air for both airports and airlines is changing in the COVID-19 situation. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Layton. I am the Industry Development Manager and Regional Airports Manager for the AAA. Today's webinar will cover topics such as the relationship between cargo and passenger-based business for airports and airlines, how these have significantly changed and are expected to continue to change post-COVID-19, and data review and the future of air cargo and new opportunities and relevance it holds for the airport sector. As always, the opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. I'll now show you a screenshot of your attendee control panel. You can see in the GoToWebinar control panel the questions/chat section. You can click into that section and submit any questions you may have at any time throughout the webinar. We will answer these questions at the conclusion of Sara's presentation. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Sara Hales, Director and Senior Consultant of Avistra. Sara has 15 years experience in infrastructure, logistics and aviation, and is known for her key role in Toowoomba Wellcamp Airport's construction and early operational phases. Sara has a solid track record in commercial innovation and excellence, aeronautical and non-aeronautical business growth and diversification. Her expertise is engaging with senior decision makers and stakeholders across airlines and network teams, tourism and economic advisory bodies, local, state and federal governments has been key to her success in driving real results for businesses. These presentations take time to prepare, and at this stage I'd like to thank Sara for her preparing for today's webinar and welcome you to the screen.
Thanks very much, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here. So we're going to dive straight into it. We've got quite a lot to cover today. I'm fascinated by air cargo since I had the great privilege of building Wellcamp Airport's international cargo business in about 2014 and 2015. The sector really captured my interest, and I've maintained a very close contact with that even since I left Wellcamp a year ago. So what has interested me really about air cargo, it's traditionally been known as something of the poor cousin of the airports and aviation sector. Airports, of course, spend a lot of their effort and energy growing a passenger business because they can attribute revenue to every passenger that walks through their doors. And now it's not so much that air cargo is no longer the poor cousin, it's more the case that the rich cousin has lost all of their money. And in that happening, air cargo has become more important, and it will be more important for quite a long time, a lot more important than it has been for both airline revenue and for business globally, and for, of course, the airport sector as well. So we're going to have a bit of a look at some of the ways this is changing over time. First of all, we'll take a look at the relative importance of air cargo and how that's evolving. So just let's take a look at global airline revenue, and we've sourced this information from IATA Industry Statistics Fact Sheet in June 2020. Global airline revenues have, of course, fallen dramatically, but you can see the difference between the passenger and cargo revenues there at the legend. Passenger revenues represented by the dark blue and cargo revenues represented by the lighter blue. So while passenger revenues have declined significantly, and the 2020 and 2021 figures are projected figures.
Sorry to interrupt, Sam, from the AAA. You just need to share your screen with us so we can see your presentation.
Oh, sorry. I thought we had.
Sorry to interrupt there.
Let me see. How's that? Can you see it now?
No.
Show my screen. Try again. We had a little bit of trouble with this before, but I think we fixed it. From the beginning. Slideshow. Flight control panel. Show screen. Now, I could use some technical advice if someone can help me out.
There we go.
Have you got it now, have you?
We've got our holding slide, but we don't have yours. What I'll do, I'll just pop myself on mute, and if you want to pop yourself on mute just for a moment, we'll put the holding slide back on, and I'll get Erin to chat you through sharing your screen again. All right, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Yep.
I've just been informed by Erin, our technical advisor, that you have been given the rights to share your screen. It may be hiding behind one of your other boxes there.
Yeah, I have accepted the rights to share my screen a couple of times. Screen of monitor 2. Screen of monitor. Screen of monitor 1. Okay, there you go. You got my presenter screen. Just trying to. There you go. How's that?
Got it now. Well,
sorry about that. I really need someone who's from Generation Y sitting here beside me, making sure I don't run a stuff with the technology. So,
no, I'll leave you to it now. Thank you.
Okay, let's get going. Rightio. So, what we're going to have a look at, this is where I was up to, is having a look at how global airline revenue has changed in June. This data source from IATA, Industry Fact Sheet, June 2020. And you can see the relationship between passenger revenue and cargo revenue, the dramatic impact of passenger revenue that COVID has had. We know all about that. But what's really interesting is to see cargo revenue relatively maintain its amount. The 2020 and 2021 numbers here are projected numbers from IATA. On the right-hand side, though, you can see cargo revenue as a percentage of airline revenue and how dramatically that is changing given the COVID situation. So you can see that prior to COVID, like 2019 in June, cargo revenues were about 14.33% of global airline revenues, whereas 2020 they're projected to be 31.5%, and 2021 even 26.2%. So it's the changing dynamics between cargo and passengers are going to happen for quite a long time, because we understand the passenger recovery is going to take quite a long time. IATA's recent projection was out to 2024 for international passenger traffic. So let's look at this data a little bit closer to home, specific to Australia. This information is sourced from Avistra, and it shows the monthly international passengers inbound to and outbound from Australia. And in the top, in the orange, the total monthly passengers. And for Australia, inbound and outbound international passenger growth has been pretty stable for a long time. And you can even see, we've taken this data right the way back to 2005, because we wanted to see, well, what does the impact of, say, the GFC or 9/11 look like on this particular growth? graph. And because this particular graph is monthly passenger numbers, you don't actually see the massive cumulative effect those events had on the industry. You can only see the small effects that they had in terms of reduced growth month to month. Now, we can also see Australia's normal passenger demand patterns driven largely by Australians holidaying overseas, and we've sort of given a really good span there. So everything's very stable. And we all know what happened when COVID hit. The impact of passenger numbers has been nothing short of devastating. From January 2020 to May 2020, passenger numbers fell dramatically, 4.1 million passengers in January to a total just short of 53,000 in May. And of course, this has led to somewhat reduced capacity, of course, or not even somewhat, dramatically reduced capacity. And available seats in and out of Australia have fallen from 5.1 million to around 200,000 in May. And flights have fallen from around about 19,000 in January to just 3,000 in May. It's interesting to see, though, that from April to May, we've seen an increase in the total number of flights, but a decrease in the total available seats. And this is due to an increase in the number of sectors being operated as cargo only or without any passengers at all. All of this data at the moment that we're running through is again from Avistra. We've got an enormous data source there, and it's a really good source for cargo-based information. There's a massive change in the relationship between the number of cargo flights being operated into and out of Australia compared to previous times. So in December 2019, a total of 376 city pairs were operated in and out of Australia, and only 5% of those city pairs were operated as cargo only. However, in May, 174 city pairs were operated into and out of Australia. 42% of them were cargo only. Note that this isn't just because of the reduction in passengers, but we've also got an increase in the number of cargo flights. So we did have only 19 cargo flights in the month, city pairs in the month. Now we have 73 cargo city pairs in that month. And through it all, cargo kicks on. So it continues to have strong demand. Passenger travel has fallen off an absolute cliff, but the world's supply chains have needed to continue to operate. Cargo volumes have been impacted by reduced consumer spending and by manufacturing shutdowns as COVID has impacted the world, and by various geopolitical tensions. However, cargo volumes haven't taken anywhere near as big a hit as the passenger traffic. Cargo has managed the urgently needed supply of medical requirements all around the world. And today we see stabilisation in the manufacturing sector and continued high demand for cargo space, pushing cargo rates upwards. In terms of the economics of an individual flight, though, let's take a look at this on a per flight basis. So we decided to take a look at the average number of passengers per flight and how has that changed. Despite, and again, this is international into and out of Australia from the Avistra data. Despite a massive reduction in capacity, the average number of passengers per flight has also fallen dramatically from around 220, 229 for inbound, outbound in January to 12 to 23 inbound, outbound, again the difference, in May. And again, the operation of cargo only flights affects this number because we have divided the number of passengers by the total number of flights, not just the passenger flights. But what's really interesting is when you consider how has the average amount of cargo per flight changed. And that's what we've got on this graph. And I've set it here next to the average number of passengers per flight. And if anything tells you the story about the shifting dynamics and importance of cargo, this one will. So average passengers per flight reduced significantly, but average freight per flight has increased by a factor of 5. And this is a big deal. So we've moved from around about 4,500 tonnes of freight per flight to around about 22,000 tonnes of freight per flight. Of course, a lot more cargo-only flights and a massive reduction in the number of passenger flights, affecting the way those numbers play out. We are seeing something of a recovery in freight, even though freight wasn't as significantly impacted as the passenger business was. It was impacted, but it's recovering, and the rate of recovery is changing. It is different across different markets. Our major air freight markets are well underway in terms of recovery. Several of these markets are receiving support from the Australian government's IFAM mechanism, and this represents freight. This data represents the amount of freight in kilos on each city pair. It does not necessarily represent the amount of freight to specific global destinations. The difference being that, for example, with Singapore, which is the top line on this graph, cargo to Singapore will often transit the global hub and move into other markets around the world. This data will include that cargo travelling to Singapore on the Singapore city pair. But it does not consider where it goes beyond that. Interesting though that the USA and Qatar are two of our larger air freight destinations, not receiving any support on the IFAM mechanism, but still making a good recovery nonetheless. Some of our smaller air freight destinations are experiencing some strong growth, and perhaps some of that is unexpected. You really couldn't call Hong Kong, which is the top line, couldn't call that a smaller air freight destination. It's one of the largest, being one of the largest global hubs. But the kilos of air freight to Hong Kong has returned to just over the figure for June last year. Interesting to see the growth in Qatar and also Taiwan. Both of those growth figures are more heavy on export cargo than they are on imports to Australia. And interesting as well that both Qatar Airlines and China Airlines operating out of Taiwan are aggressively adding capacity into the market at the moment, and particularly in Australia. So you know, they've got a lot of flights, which is really interesting. Qatar in particular seem to be positioning their global hub in Doha very strongly, and I noticed that they've recently announced that they'll be flying out of Adelaide again soon too. The orange line at the bottom is Nauru. Now, it's because of the scale of the graph, it's difficult to see the amount of growth that they've had there, but statistically, from a percentage point of view, they've actually had one of the strongest growths, likely to be linked to Australia's humanitarian and border protection initiatives and operations on Nauru. So what are the recovery factors here? We've had a good look across the data and who's recovering, and is it related more to imports or exports, or you know, what is it related to? And there seems to be a number of different factors at play, but none of these factors seem to be at play in every single strong growth story or strong recovery story. The factors that we think are involved are certainly the IFAM support. 8 out of 10 of our highest volume markets are receiving IFAM support, and 1 out of 3 of our strongest growth markets are receiving that support. And that's most definitely making cargo capacity available to continue the operation of global supply chains, even though it's not commercially viable for airlines at this point. And I think the hope is that it will become commercially viable, and airlines will be able to make what fleet and network changes they need to make in order to operate those routes commercially ongoing. The relative progress of a nation through the COVID experience is definitely ranking as something that tells us that markets are recovering. Singapore, Hong Kong, China, for example, showing some good recovery, but that's because their countries and their economies are on the way to recovery out of the COVID experience. However, countries like India, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Chile, where they are still experiencing a lot of disruption in their economies locally, they are still at less than 20% of their previous air cargo weight. So they've got a way to go until they start to recover. And availability of capacity seems to be a real a real trigger to the recovery of the market as well. And that's probably why we're seeing Qatar and Taiwan experiencing strong recovery and strong growth, because they simply have the capacity to support that. Let's take a quick look domestically. What's happening inside Australia? It's a very similar story. The light blue line shows the impact to the passenger traffic of COVID, and the dark blue line shows the impact of COVID on cargo on board. Very similar story. Speaking with domestic cargo operators, they are experiencing strong demand. Quite possibly a lot of this is driven by e-commerce, which has experienced a lot of growth. So pretty much the same story in domestic aviation. Globally, this information from both the TAC index and from IATA. Globally, cargo demand fell by 17.6% year-on-year in June, and capacity fell by greater than that, by 34.1%. Belly capacity shrank enormously by 70%. And that's important in Australia because something like 80 or 90% of Australia's international cargoes travel in the belly holds of passenger aircraft. We see that because of the addition of freighter aircraft operating without passengers, there was an increase in capacity of 32%. Globally, we believe manufacturing is stabling a lot. People are back at work manufacturing, and the need for urgent medical supplies has mostly stabilised with the urgent logistics needs for that sort of flattening out a little bit more. Very interesting to see on the graph on the right that air cargo is commanding a greater share of global trade than what it has previously. And that's more than likely because of a reduction in shipping as well as an increase in actual air cargo compared to the rate of shipping. And air freight rates remain extremely high. I like this quote from Peter Stallion from Freight Investor Services, who he quotes that it's about 25% above the 2019 level at the moment. Now, it has been higher. It went very high, but it has come back down and is sitting around about 25%. Above previous levels. It will be interesting to see how that changes. One of the things that I think we may see is that the long-term recovery that's expected for the passenger traffic is going to lead to continued long-term freight rates, and if that may lead to the sort of network and fleet adjustment, which make freighter aircraft more available to the market in order to meet the global transit need better than what can be met with existing freighter market or freighter fleet. So also Cathay Pacific, and just probably an example of something that's happening all around the world to many, many airlines, is that they've identified that this is a really important part of their business at the moment. So Mr. Lamb, who is Cathay Pacific Airways Chief Customer and Consumer Officer, quoted just yesterday, I think, in the Lodestar, cargo continues to be a vital part of their business, and interesting that re-establishing a dedicated director cargo position on the senior leadership team as they aim to become the most customer-centric air cargo services provider in the world. And that's a curious thing from Cathay Pacific, because we see a lot of the very customer-centric air cargo service providers are organisations like DHL, who are operating their own aircraft. So one has to wonder, is Cathay Pacific considering any moves up and down that supply chain at the moment? In June, the airline operated only 4% of its global capacity, but cargo performance has remained really strong. So what's impacting air freight's future? There's a number of things increasing the outlook for air freight in the future, and there are a number of aspects that are decreasing the outlook for air freight in the future. We know that the passenger recovery is going to take 4 years. However, we also know that domestic recovery will happen faster than that, or at least we hope so. So, you know, what are some of these impacts that are going to shape the way it looks like in the future? This information is from Australia Post in their Inside Australian Online Shopping 2020 E-commerce Industry Report. It's a really interesting read if you want to get your hands on it. It's available on the internet, like all good things. And they experienced enormous growth. And various commentators have said they've experienced things like 6 years growth over a couple of weeks, or 10 years growth over a month or so. An enormous challenge for Australia Post to flex that organisation and take advantage of this growth. And I think it's remarkable that a leader like Christine Holgate, she's done a remarkable job with her team in capturing and taking advantage of this opportunity for her organisation. But massive growth through the early COVID period. This is really just around April, this data here. But there's a strong indication that the change in buyer behaviour is permanent. 5.2 million Australian households shopped online in April, and a couple of 100,000 of those were brand new to online shopping and hadn't done it before. The first 8 weeks of the COVID experience saw year-on-year growth for Australia Post in this segment of 80%. And Victoria's year-on-year growth for Australia Post in July was 118%. We think that this buyer behaviour might become long-term and permanent because of the amount of time it'll take to move through the coronavirus situation. It will be a long enough time to permanently change buyer behaviour, as they will have adopted new behaviours. Additionally, in the adoption of e-commerce and internet-based shopping, there are some consumers who hadn't got their head around it and they didn't want to do it, and now they've had to, and they'll probably realise that it wasn't too bad and they might do it again. Saves getting sore feet walking around a massive shopping centre. So e-commerce has a particular logistics requirement that is supported by some of the organisations themselves operating their own aircraft, like Amazon, but they need daily small package type logistics. It's very data driven, often very automated, and needs to be able to support cargo going to very many shippers in small quantities. So it's a very specific logistics need. One of the other things we're going to see really shape the industry is industrial transformation and technology. There's such a lot of talk about air cargo, particularly around perishable products, but the reality is Australia's perishable exports are not that important to the business case. They take advantage of cheaper air cargo space made available by other products typically. What is really important to the fundamental economics is technology and high value, urgently needed, and sometimes large format technologies that are moving around the world. So we believe that Apple will make another tech release in September, and that always puts and will put enormous pressure on the global air cargo network as they distribute that technology around the world. Additionally, as manufacturing transitions towards more smart technology bases, the replacement of manufacturing equipment around the world and the integration of the technologies that support that from a hardware perspective will also create volumes on air cargo. So it is interesting to understand where in Australia are making those types of products and where in Australia are those products needed the most. If you want to look at what is going to shape future air cargo demand, the tech sector is going to be a large part of that. As a part of this industrial revolution that we're having in the middle of a global pandemic. So supply chains will also fundamentally change in response to the operational risk experienced through COVID, and also in response to shifting consumer sentiments. And this line of thinking is very apparent if you read papers from Deloitte, so KPMG, and Forbes, and probably quite a lot of similar organisations that we were already experiencing a commercial shift towards much more purpose-based and impact-aware business practices, and that was very much being driven by Generation Y. COVID could be seen as a catalyst, pushing the last of the baby boomers out of the marketplace, creating opportunity for Generation X to occupy the few very, very senior leadership positions, and meaning that Generation Y are really stepping up into most leadership positions and starting to really control the consumer demands. Generation Y have their expectations in terms of the impact and values that business brings to the table has seen things established like social awareness-based investments, for example, ethical investments, environmentally conscious investments. Behaving consistently with their expectations is going to be really important to organisations that want to attract talent, capital, or market in the coming times. So we were already going through that transition, and COVID, if anything, has catalysed that, made it happen faster, and added new transitions as well. So from a supply chain point of view, there's such a great awareness that these global supply chains were somewhat vulnerable, and we now know COVID has happened once, something similar could happen again, and we better build businesses that are resilient to impacts like that. So we're going to see a localization and a contraction of supply chains as organisations seek to manage that risk. Locally, we're already seeing that. Speaking with exporters in the Central Queensland region, we've heard that they're already receiving approaches from food manufacturing businesses like McCain's, for example, who were previously sourcing their product offshore and processing it and then bringing it into Australia, but now want to shift their whole supply chain. So that's happening right now. We'll also see supply chains become much more agile and resilient. We might see some deliberate redundancies built into supply chains, and we'll see individual business units be much more flexible and able to adapt to change. Supply chains will become smarter, and that includes the manufacturing technologies that we spoke about a moment ago, as well as the way the supply chain works. Those smarts will help to build its resilience. There will also be, in some cases, in organisations that can justify it and can afford it, a shift towards owning some of their own logistics. Amazon, again, is a good example of this, and we increasingly hear of large organisations seeking to own not only their vertical supply chain, but also the logistics that connect the parts of it in order to have better control when an impact like this happens. And also, supply chains will become more sustainable, both economically and socially and environmentally. So supply chains are going to go through some enormous transformation. Some of that's going to be good for air cargo, like the adoption of greater smarts is going to be good for air cargo. However, the localization and contraction of supply chains is not as good for international air cargo, as you can imagine. Geopolitical change, I think, is most definitely going to be something that shapes the way air cargo recovers. Australia's relationship with China comes to mind. There's been a fantastic trade relationship, and I think it's something that we all hope will continue, but we just don't know yet how that is going to turn out. There are other, though, emerging markets that could also be great trade relationships for Australia. India comes to mind as being a great opportunity. And Australian government policy around who we are negotiating with, who we're having free trade agreements with, what is our appetite to give various concessions in order to reduce various trade barriers. So there's Also, the situation in the US is interesting. What is the US's position going to be globally? The Asia-US leg has been one of the major commercial drivers of international air cargo for a long time now. And if the particularly the China to US leg is going to reduce, what's going to take that place in terms of the viability of international air cargoes? So a lot of different things happening. Some of the things are going to be good for air cargo, and some of the things are going to be difficult. But one thing is clear, that the recovery will be slow, recovery for passengers will be slow. Air cargo is going to have to find a way of servicing global supply chains in the meantime, and figuring out what it looks like in the new normal. And if anything, we know the new normal will mean being able to cope with a lot of change. So we may see much more agile cargo networks as well. So during the recovery, though, air cargo has a really important role to play. Maintaining global supply chains, maintaining those relationships is really important, because when they fall apart and the global supply chain falls apart, it's very difficult to repair. We're likely to find closer to home solutions. And global supply chains in terms of getting urgently needed medical equipment is also important role for air cargo at the moment. Air cargo has an important role to play in facilitating the growth in e-commerce, and is an important airline revenue source at a time when there is very little money flying around the world. That also makes it an important airport revenue source. Now, airports haven't positioned themselves well to collect revenues from air cargo. In most cases, the airport will collect a landing fee and may collect some sort of concession or rent-based share from refueling or ground handling or cargo terminal participants in that supply chain. Air cargo also offers an opportunity to keep the sector flying a bit, keep pilots in the air, keep a few planes flying around, just keep it working so the whole thing isn't quite as mothballed as it would be otherwise. And also it has the role of facilitating the development of new supply chains and global relationships, and to solidify the role of the aviation industry in the new normal. Air cargo has an important role to play in that. So what are the takeaways for Australia's airports? Number one, air cargo is important. We haven't really given it a lot of thought before, been very focused on passengers and flashy passenger terminals and maximising the amount of revenue per passenger that we can gain for the airport. But the fundamentals have changed, and they will change again. But at least over the next 4 years, while we're building passenger recovery, we know that the dynamic between airline passengers and airline cargo has changed. So it's an opportunity to seek how does the airport take advantage of that. Now, the understanding your own air cargo market is really important, and the economic drivers of air cargo generally is also an important part of your overall aviation business development plan, both domestically and internationally. So there's some real fundamentals that are going to change, but this is going to become an important part of the industry to wrap your head around. And in particular, just like airlines are dependent upon us, the airport partner, for intel on the local market in terms of our passengers, that's also going to be the case for cargo. Airline partners are going to be dependent upon you, their airport partner, to come to them with intel around what's happening from a cargo perspective. Air cargo business case development is not all that different from passenger business case development. Air cargo is similar to passengers in that there are different classes of fares, if you like, or air freight rates for different classes of product. The customer mix is important in air cargo business development. So we need to understand what is the amount of inbound versus outbound cargoes. What are the different types of cargoes? How big are they? How big is each individual unit? And then also, how many of them? are there and what do they weigh, where do they want to go or where do they want to come from, destinations and origins, what particular needs do they have from a logistics point of view? Is there a frequency need? Or there special handling requirements like for pharmaceuticals, for example, or for perishables? And is there a seasonality, for example? The grape season can put a lot of cargo onto Australia's air cargo sector, but only does that for a couple of months in a year. Really important to understand the existing options and their cost and the sensitivity of the market to additional cost. It's not unusual for Australian exporters to tell you or to tell us that they want access to air freight, and then you ask them how much more are they willing to pay over the cost of trucking, and they say, oh no, I'm not paying any more. The reality is air freight is more expensive than trucking in the vast majority of cases. So understanding price sensitivity and what they're currently paying is important. Understand what exists in terms of the cargo supply chain already for that region or that airport, and what infrastructure and regulatory needs need to be addressed. And then, of course, in any airline attraction job, there are questions to ask yourself around appetite for risk sharing or other investments in airline attraction. So not that different really from developing a passenger business case. Certainly developing partners is really important. Understanding who commissions air cargo is important as well. And the freight forwarding industry plays a very large role in that. So simply speaking to exporters or importers is not sufficient. You do need to make sure you engage with the freight forwarder industry as well. So that's it from me. I welcome some questions, and thank you very much for hanging around and listening. I hope you got something from that.
Thank you so much, Sara, for that presentation. Extremely interesting.
Pleasure.
I've got some questions here. Do you believe consumers will be less price elastic with the change to this supply chain domestic manufacturer?
Do I believe consumers will be less price elastic?
Yes.
Yeah. I actually think we're going to see a divergence. So I think some consumers will be and some won't be, depending where they sit at in the economy. And I don't know that you can say that they're all going to behave in one way.
Okay. In Australian air cargo, how important are imports as opposed to exports?
Okay, so in Australia, if you look at the building a business case for an international airline from Australia to a Northern Hemisphere destination, typically for the business case, around about 75% of that revenue will actually be driven from import cargo rather than export cargo. So imports are really important, and it's probably little known in Australia that is the case, like outside the airline sector. There can be the thinking inside Australia that we've got a bunch of lettuces or something that have got to go to a large global market, so therefore we'll get a freighter. They're simply not worth enough money. But import cargoes tend to be a higher value manufactured product. Australia tends to import these high value technical products and export lettuces and beef and coal and wheat and things like that. So the import business case for new cargo routes into Australia is absolutely vital.
Okay, great. We've got a couple more questions. Can you talk about the difference between cargo under passengers as opposed to cargo on dedicated freighter aircraft? What's the difference? Is cargo space on freighters more or less expensive than on passenger flights, or the same price?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of Australia's air cargo task, international air cargo task, and also domestically, in terms of that, the underneath passengers cargo represents a much greater proportion of the market than the dedicated freighter aircraft portion does. Looking at the larger aircraft and the international operation, large wide-body freighter operations are expensive, and they really exist to support cargoes that for some reason needs to be on a freighter aircraft. Perhaps it has a special handling requirement that can't be facilitated on passengers. Maybe it's too big. Underneath the belly of passengers, you can only go to a maximum height of about 1.6 meters, whereas on a freighter aircraft like the 747-8, you can go to 2 meters high. So maybe the thing is just too big. Generally speaking, the cost of space on a freighter aircraft is more expensive than it is on a passenger aircraft, traditionally. However, there is some significant change in that space at the moment, but traditionally space on a freighter aircraft is a lot more expensive because the shippers will be prepared to pay because they're higher value product and they need the specific capabilities of the freighter aircraft. So a lot of the perishable product goes on to underneath passengers, or has traditionally gone underneath passengers, and it is a challenge and a potential risk for Australia's perishable exports that it will no longer, or at least not for quite a long time, be able to access the same cheap under passenger belly spaces it has been able to access in the past. So that's something that as a nation we really need to think about how we're going to address.
That's actually really interesting, Sara. I've never looked at it from that perspective before, so thank you for that. On the assumption that cargo activity would substantially, I beg your pardon, sorry. On the assumption that cargo activity would sustainably be higher, what are the facility changes that airports have to consider over the medium term?
The answer to that question is really different depending on whether you're considering international cargo flights or domestic cargo flights. So let's look at a domestic cargo situation first of all. Other than, if the airport already had cargo facilities for domestic cargoes, there's probably very little that's needed to support that change, unless it was already not sufficient for the market. Some markets we're seeing they were operating, they had domestic freighter operations, like the toll priority network is a fantastic network that can support a lot of urgent connectivity overnight across Australia. And perishable shippers might need to put cargo on that network, but the home airport might not have something as simple as a cold room to look after products in the case of a delay. In a domestic context, adding that type of thing to an airport is very low cost. Doesn't need to be a big cold room, and it doesn't need to meet border agency requirements, but of course it does need to meet the quality requirements for food products, for example. So for domestic operations, there's not all that much that needs to change unless there was already a problem. However, for international operations, there's a significant amount of infrastructure and regulation that's required to support international freighter operations. A lot of the time, the types of aircraft used for international freighter operations are large, wide-body aircraft, long range. They need large aviation infrastructure, long runways, wide taxiways. So they from an aviation infrastructure point of view, that would need to be sufficient. And then from a cargo supply chain point of view, you will need things like freight forwarders in the local community, a cargo terminal on the airport. The cargo terminal will need to be licensed with the border agencies such as Customs and with the Department of Agriculture. And then, of course, there are also the screening requirements that apply to that cargo as well.
Okay. So I guess delving into that answer just a little bit more, have new security screening requirements for air cargo impacted volumes? And has it changed shipper behaviour due to the cost or hassle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't seen any direct impact to volumes, although that may have occurred on a micro level. So there may be some shippers who have been unwilling to accommodate cost or hassle. However, the larger shippers with sufficient scale, and I guess when you're asking logistics questions, it often comes down to what is the scale of the shipper. Shippers with scale will just tackle these problems, and shippers with scale are the ones upon which we're going to build a business. But smaller shippers will find it difficult to tackle these sorts of problems inside their P&L, like it just makes them unprofitable. But there are some really good processes such as the non-consignor network and also bringing the screening process to the processing sector itself. The processing sector was already doing so many things. For example, in meat processing, they were already x-raying their cargo before it even went to the airport. They'd x-ray cargo because they're looking for metal contamination from the processing, from the manufacturing process. Now they can apply the processes they already had in-house to meeting their transport security requirements, and it actually makes the system and the process better. A little bit like when we introduced GST all those years ago, and everyone kicked and screamed and thought it was terrible, but actually it was a process improvement. Once you got your head around it, it was fine.
Excellent. Okay, and the last question for today. Do you see innovation in narrow body loading of underbelly passenger narrow body, i.e. currently much is hand loaded, is now the opportunity for redesign of underbelly or process?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. Yeah, and I think over the next 4 years, or it's my hope that over the next 4 years, we're going to see innovations like that, and also in terms of aircraft configuration, which aircraft are being used to fly cargo, how that works. I think we are going to see innovations like that, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Once again, thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you for taking the time to put it together, and of course being with us this morning into this afternoon. Just to wrap up for today, the recording will be available in Airport Alert and emailed to everyone who registered directly once available. We are encouraging our members to provide feedback on any other topics that they would like to see covered in the 2020 webinar series. If you have an idea or would like to present, please email events@airports.asn.au. Thank you everyone for joining. The next webinar in our series is taking place next week, Wednesday the 12th of August. That'll be presented by Xavier and Pete from Ademia, with the topic being the contactless passenger journey using biometrics. You can register for this event by visiting the AAA website. Please enjoy the remainder of your day. Sara, thank you once again. Please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again online at the next webinar.
Okay, thanks, Sam.